Welcome to Lecture 3. This lecture is on the basics of language development. Individuals with autism often have language difficulties, and so it's important to know what the basics of language development are. First of all, we want to know the difference between speech, language, and communication. Speech is the actual physiological act of making sounds. Language is symbolic, it's a rule based system, and communication is through a shared code. So when you speak English with someone, everyone is sharing the same code, the same rules of English, which are different than the rules of German or Chinese or sign language. In order for something to be considered communication, there's four required elements. There needs to be a sender of the message. So I am sending a message. There needs to be a receiver of the message, and hopefully you listening to this on the other side are receiving the messages that I'm sending. There has to be a shared intent to communicate. I want to communicate something and you want to hear it. And there has to be a shared means of communication. So we're both speaking the same language. So often individuals with autism, um, they may have difficulties with language, but they also may have difficulties with some of those communication elements. And if any of those pieces are missing, communication is not occurring. When we think about language itself, we want to think about form, content, and use. Form involves the phonology, morphology, and syntax. Content involves the use of semantics, and use is pragmatics, and I'm going to talk about each of those things. So form, phonology is the sounds in language, and phonemes are the smallest linguistic sounds, like the b, the ah, the ah, ch, sh. There are, I think, 43 um, phonemes in the English language. Morphology is rules that govern how the words are made, and morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a language. So, for example, dog is a morpheme. Dogs has two morphemes because that S changes the meaning of the word from one dog to two. And finally, syntax is the rules of grammar. We have to say things in certain ways for them to be understood. In content and use, semantics are rules that say what words can go together meaningfully. I can't say green calendar chicken giggle. There's no meaning to that. So there are actually rules about how words go together meaningfully. And pragmatics is another area that particularly individuals who may have good language skills, this is where they may run into trouble is with their use of pragmatics, which is the use of language for communication. And in pragmatics, the responses have to be relevant to the conversation in terms of the quantity of information. If you're giving too much quantity, it can be a problem. The quality of information and the manner of information. Now, it's important to know the development of language because language develops on a certain pace, and an individual may actually not have a language development problem. They just may not have reached that stage yet. Pre-linguistic development is that early language that we see with babies and very young babies. So it starts off with those reflexive sound productions like crying. Cooing is when you start to hear that ooh, ah, and they're making actual vowel sounds. And it means that they're actually starting to build the muscle skills to control sound production. And then babbling is when you're adding consonant sounds. Now, communicative intentions start to build as well. So in the perlocutionary stage, that's with very young babies. And that's where you're often finding that caregivers are actually giving meaning to behavior that happens. So the infant is crying and they say, oh, that cry means it may or may not. But that helps develop the illocutionary stage where intentional communication begins, where the babies actually start to make sound with communicative intent. You'll also see the development of joint attention at this stage. And finally, in the locutionary stage, that's where vocalizations are combined with gestures to request, demand, and comment. Now, expressive language development in the first 2 months is just reflexive crying, and there begins to be some sound discrimination. Um, in the second few months, you'll see the cooing vowel sounds, and that's when differentiated crying begins to happen purposefully by the infant. In stage 3, 16 to 30 weeks, you'll hear vocal play and babbling. In stage 4, you'll start to see those CV combinations, ma, da, ba, repeated. And then by about a year, by about 9 months to a year and a half, you'll start to see true language production with jargon and first words. And jargon is when they're making actually babbling sounds, but it actually sounds like they're trying to say something. They just don't yet have the words, and then the words develop. In the preschool years, so after about a year to a year and a half, you'll start to see the emergence of true words, which are usually nouns, they're labeling. In stage two, you'll see prefixes, suffixes, and prepositions, and they'll begin to use pronouns I, you, although they often mix them up at this stage. In stage three, so about 2.5, they're starting to use more complex sentences. They're adding adjectives, they're using more complex verb forms, they're saying no to things, they're using negation. Um, at about 3 to 3.5, they're starting to have more sentence coordination and embedded sentence use. And then finally, from 3.5 to 4, you'll see that their sentence use and their word structures are becoming better and better.